Deep geopolitical divisions are clouding two international summits this week, ASEAN and G20.
Chinese President Xi Jinping is not attending the G20 gathering in New Delhi this weekend, less than 2 weeks after having attended the BRICS summit in South Africa, where he called for what he described as a more equitable world order. Mr. Xi's next major event on the world stage will be the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing this October. Russian President Vladimir Putin will attend that forum, while he won't be at the G20 meeting this week.
Now, the summit in New Delhi will be dominated by the West and its allies. U.S. President Joe Biden will be flying to India and then later to Vietnam, while giving the ASEAN meetings in Jakarta a miss.
The Biden administration has been strengthening an arc of security alliances in the Indo-Pacific amid rising tensions with China. China, on its part, has said that it hopes the ASEAN summit does not undermine regional peace and stability, even as its newly released map has irked some ASEAN members. Well, we're joined now by Joseph Liow, Kah Kee Professor and Dean at the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences of Nanyang Technological University. Good morning, Professor. President Biden, he's not going to be at the ASEAN summit, which some say is really indicative of how little value he places on the ASEAN grouping. Is this going to be an opportunity for China? Do you think members will now lean closer to Beijing?
Well, I think first we need to recognize that this is not the first time that the American president is absent from major ASEAN summits, right? His predecessors had done this before. Second, I think the Biden administration would respond to that by saying that they have, in fact, ramped up their engagement with ASEAN over the last couple of years, including hosting a summit for ASEAN leaders in DC, right? But having said that, I think his absence is unfortunate. It is not so much that there is less attention to Southeast Asia, because mind you, he is going to Vietnam after the G20. So I think it does say a lot about where ASEAN may fit in terms of U.S. priorities with regards to the Indo-Pacific region today.
Professor, it's not only Biden's absence, but the bloc's inability to resolve crucial issues in the region has led many to question ASEAN's value and relevance. How optimistic are you that the bloc will prove its worth? What should it do?
So there are a number of major issues that confront ASEAN, and I think it's hit a bit of an impasse in quite a number of them. The main one, obviously, is Myanmar. I think when Indonesia took over as the chair, it was quite adamant, quite bullish, in fact, about wanting to make progress on Myanmar, on a route map for the implementation of the 5 points, among other things. But as we have seen over the last few months, not much has been achieved. So that is a major stain, I think, as far as how ASEAN has been struggling with this issue still. And there are other issues as well. The South China Sea, as I think someone mentioned earlier, the release by China of the national boundaries map, which is a routine exercise for them. But obviously, it has riled some of the countries in the region, primarily those who have disputes with China over the South China Sea. So the question there is how far ASEAN is going to be able to push or accelerate the code of conduct. And again, if you look at what it has been struggling to achieve, there hasn't been much progress there as well. So quite some significant obstacles for the organization.
Yeah, that's a great segue to my next question. Timing is everything, as they say, right? And China decided to unveil its new map just ahead of these regional summits. What message is Beijing trying to send? And also, what impact is this map going to have on a resolution around the disputed regions?
I think on one hand, we know that this is a routine exercise, as I mentioned earlier. But on the other hand, the timing is interesting. I think the Chinese make very clear where they stand as far as South China Sea and their claims are. And I thought it was very interesting that at the same time as they were releasing the map, they were calling for ASEAN to try to push forward and make progress and try to get this South China Sea Code of Conduct thing moving. So there's a bit of tension there as well, as far as what China really wants in terms of the future of the South China Sea.
And Professor, on the issue of Myanmar, the lack of progress of the 5-point consensus has led many to say that there is a need for the ASEAN to now look beyond the 5PC and perhaps allow the group to make a decision, even in the absence of consensus from all member states. What's your take on this? Would you agree?
I think it is going to be very difficult to do that, simply because you have ASEAN, an organization that encompasses a range of countries with very diverse strategic outlooks and countries that have different interests as far as the situation in Myanmar is concerned. So while, yes, we need to really try to be creative in terms of how this problem can be solved, I think ASEAN certainly has a stake in it. I mean, Myanmar is still a member. There isn't a mechanism to suspend or even expel Myanmar. I think this question of whether or not the ASEAN chair should be the one appointing the special envoy or an ASEAN special envoy in order to ensure continuity in the engagement efforts, I think that's another question that ASEAN has to deal with. So it is a problem that ASEAN has to face up to.
Professor, when Indonesia took over as ASEAN chair, President Joko Widodo promised that regional cooperation wouldn't be stymied by geopolitics. At this point, how would you assess Jakarta's performance? Do you think it lived up to expectations as chair?
Well, I think first we need to recognize that these are quite significant problems. And ASEAN with Indonesia with its wealth of experience and expertise in ASEAN, it still understandably struggle a bit because it's really something like herding cats, right? To try to get all ASEAN states on the same page on any given issue. And we should also remember that this is a build-up to the Indonesian presidential election. So I think a lot of people in Indonesia are really more focused in terms of what the future of the Indonesian polity, the Indonesian leadership is going to be as it moves towards the elections next year. So foreign policy issues, ASEAN chairmanship, it's still important, but it has to compete with domestic priorities for attention.
And Professor, before we let you go, as Laos is set to take the reins in 2024, how might the transition impact the dynamics and priorities of ASEAN, given that it's heavily dependent on China?
Well, let me put it this way. Laos taking over, I'm sure the Laotians will try their best. I'm sure ASEAN member states, neighbors and partners will help the Laotians out in terms of setting the agenda and executing the agenda. But bear in mind, we're moving from Indonesia, which is one of the most experienced, one of the most, the largest country in Southeast Asia, and very much seen as a driver of ASEAN all these years, all these decades. If this is what Indonesia has managed to achieve, moving on to Laos, it will be interesting.
All right, Professor, thank you so much. Appreciate your time this morning. Professor Joseph Liow, Kah Kee Professor and Dean at the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, Nanyang Technological University.